While fighting raged around the Mule Shoe at Spotsylvania, General Sheridan, who was brought east with Grant to command the Army of the Potomac's Cavalry Corps, wanted to launch a raid against Richmond and force a confrontation with Stuart. On May 11th, Stuart blocked Sheridan's troopers near the old and abandoned Yellow Tavern in the distant northern suburbs of Richmond. It was a classic fight of charge and countercharge, but Stuart's 4,500 men were outnumbered by the nearly 10,000 Federal cavalry. In addition to being outnumbered, Stuart's men had to begin facing the Federal cavalry, who had been equipped with Spencer repeating carbines. In the end, the bold Confederate Cavalier was shot down and his brigades defeated. Lee would not only be without his trusted subordinate, but Sheridan and his subordinates would hereafter outclass anything the Confederacy could throw up against the Army of the Potomac's cavalry. A more conventional campaign was at the same time being enacted in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. The Great Valley of the Commonwealth was a definite breadbasket for the Army of Northern Virginia. It was filled with great farms of tall grains and thriving swine and cattle. It had been defended and protected in 1862 by the legendary Stonewall Jackson. The Federal Army was content with small raids from its base at Winchester, and that post was obliterated by Ewell's men in the first stages of the Gettysburg Campaign. In the spring of 1864, Grant assigned General Franz Sigel to command a small army to damage Confederate efforts in the valley and possibly divert troops from Lee. The fiery John C. Breckinridge, the once Vice President of the United States, was placed in command of a hodgepodge army of 4,000 to 5,000 men that included a battalion of VMI cadets. Breckinridge, an inspiring figure and a veteran of many fights in the Western theater, was an aggressive officer, and though outnumbered by more than double, he went after Sigel. Skirmishing occurred between the two sides, but the main action would occur just outside Newmarket, just west of the Valley Turnpike on May 15th. The fighting took place during a rain and thunderstorm, which gave a surreal canopy to the landscape and the imagery of war. The infantry and artillery fighting was a back-and-forth affair, with the Confederate forces not being able to make a gain on Sigel's position. A gap opened on the line, and it seemed as if the Confederates were getting the worst of the fighting. It was at this point that General Breckinridge had to turn to his reserve, the 257 VMI cadets, commanded by 24-year-old Colonel Scott Shipp. The battalion took an advance on Captain Henry A. DuPont's United States Artillery Battery across the field. Shipp was struck by the concussion of an artillery shell and awoke in time to see his battalion swarming across the Federal guns and driving back the 34th Massachusetts Infantry. From this impetus, Sigel decided to retreat from the field. The Battle of Newmarket was fairly won by Breckinridge's small command, but much honor should be afforded to the boys of the Academy, who lost 10 of their number killed and 48 more wounded. The victory cleared the valley of a Federal presence for several weeks and allowed Lee not to worry about his left flank. Also in Virginia at this time, of both Meade's and Sigel's commands, was that of General Benjamin Butler's newly dubbed Army of the James, consisting of approximately 30,000 men. Butler's men would face many of the same troops that they had faced in Charleston and in the Carolina theater of operations, ultimately facing off against General Beauregard. The lesser-known battles of Port Walthall, Swift Creek, Chester Station, Warebottom Church, and Drury's Bluff were quite severe fights, with Butler's men consistently being repulsed at most instances. As this overland campaign moved into June and got closer to Richmond, the stakes would be much higher for Lee, then operating in the shadow of the capital itself. It was as if 1862 was replaying all over again, until Cold Harbor. The Battle of Cold Harbor was the perfection of modern trench warfare on two levels. The first of which was Lee's veterans and engineers knowing how to lay out lines of concentrated and overlapping fire. The second was the speed in which the Army of Northern Virginia could entrench. The battles at the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and the North Anna were a university to this learning. Grant attacked headlong into Lee's men and achieved nothing but the loss of thousands of his men. It seemed as if the campaign was a deadly repetition of the same cycle for the Army of the Potomac: attack and die. It quickly became obvious that Richmond would not be taken in this manner, as Lee's force was too strong. So Grant, convinced that he would move by the left flank with impunity, did so again, using Butler's force at Bermuda Hundred as a covering force. Grant, though seriously defeated at Cold Harbor, refused to pull out and lived by his pledge about fighting it out if it would take all summer. Lee's army stretched, but never broke, and by the late winter of 1864, his army was defending a front of almost 40 miles. The commander of the Army of Northern Virginia knew Grant's policy was working. For Lee and his army, it was just a matter of time. One of the most striking and saddest parts of Grant's strategy in early 1864 was the stopping of the prisoner exchange. Federal soldiers would remain in disgusting Southern prison pens for years rather than for months. The most notorious of these places was Camp Sumter, Georgia, otherwise known as Andersonville. Approximately 45,000 men would be sent through the sprawling compound in southern Georgia, and more than 12,000 would die there. The camp was not intended for that many men, but due to the stopping of the prisoner exchange and several Confederate victories resulting in large amounts of federal prisoners, the compound grew to over 26 acres. Though that plot of land seems big, it was choked with the pathetic forms of what were once strapping Northern youth, the embodiment of American bravery. There were many reasons for the ill treatment of Union prisoners there, ultimately coming back upon the responsibility of the camp commandant, Captain Henry Wirtz, who would wind up being hung for war crimes. Andersonville was not the only prison that systematically destroyed life, as prisoner of war camps on both sides had very similar issues, usually falling upon the commander of the post. It could be said that there were shortages in the South and food was scarce, as were medical and clothing supplies, but that could not be said about the northern camps. The most noted of these camps, in Elmira, New York, was what a Confederate prisoner of 1864 called Hellmira. The camp contained approximately 12,000 prisoners, and almost 3,000 of them died from exposure, poor sanitation, or lack of medical supplies. The commander of the post was often noted as being proud of his contribution to the war by his inmates dying under his care or lack thereof. Other prisoner of war camps, Point Lookout, Fort Delaware, Camp Douglas, etc., all had hordes of Confederates die from one cause or another. It was a long-standing shame, but in the end, no Northern officers were brought to trial for negligence.
Washington, D.C., August 18th, 1864. Soldiers, you are about to return to your homes and your friends after having, as I learned, performed in camp a comparatively short term of duty in this great contest. I am greatly obliged to you and to all who have come forward at the call of their country. I wish it might be more generally and universally understood what the country is now engaged in. We have, as all will agree, a free government, where every man has a right to be equal with every other man. In this great struggle, this form of government and every form of human right is endangered if our enemies succeed. There is more involved in this contest than is realized by everyone. There is involved in this struggle the question whether your children and my children shall enjoy the privileges we have enjoyed. I say this in order to impress upon you, if you are not already so impressed, that no small matter should divert us from our great purpose. There may be mistakes made sometimes. Things may be done wrong while the officers of the government do all they can to prevent mistakes. But I beg of you, as citizens of this great republic, not to let your minds be carried off from the great work we have before us. This struggle is too large for you to be diverted from it by any small matter. When you return to your homes, rise up to the height of a generation of men worthy of a free government, and we will carry out the great work we have commenced. I return to you my sincere thanks, soldiers, for the honor you have done me this afternoon.
Thanks for watching. If you'd like to help us produce more compelling historical content like this, please like, comment below, and share this video with fellow history buffs. And of course, be sure to subscribe to help keep history happening.